Hi and welcome to this Explain-Ash video tutorial. My name is Eberle-Geist, or in the original German pronunciation Randolph-Geist, and I'm an Oracle geek, spending a lot of time trying to understand how the Oracle database engine works. In particular, I'm specialized in understanding how the SQL engine works and how the cost-based optimizer works, and with that knowledge I can troubleshoot the most common SQL execution scenarios, and I can also explain to you why these things happen, and I can also provide ideas how to fix them and how to address them. As part of that, I also provide workshops where I explain to developers how they have to read database execution plans, how Oracle actually executes these SQL executions, and the most common typical inefficient SQL executions and what you can do to avoid them, what you can do to work around them, what features you might want to use of the database, which features you might want to avoid depending on what you're trying to do, so that you can make most of the database also in terms of performance. This also means performance by design, which means that rather than troubleshooting and fixing things afterwards, you might be able to come up with ideas upfront as part of the application design, how you may want to lay out the tables in order to provide optimal access, which database features you might want to use, which database features you might want to not use, or for instance, I might be able to tell you if you attempt to use a certain database feature, what that might have an impact in terms of performance. So all that stuff can be provided as in-house workshops, so if you're interested, get in touch with me. Besides that, I'm Oracle ACE Director, so part of the Oracle ACE program, member of the Oak Table, and also co-author and contributed to the Expert Oracle Practices book, which although it's I think more than 3 years old now, I think it's still a very recommended read. So what you're currently looking at is the first part of this Explain-Ash video tutorial, where I give you an introduction, and so the only part where I'll go through these kind of slides. So just to give you an overview, there will be a second part where I explain the tool, how to use it, the general usage, how to invoke it, what is it good for, and basically the tool in action, so that you get an idea how you can make use of the tool. Then there will be another part where I explain the so-called row source statistics functionality of the script, what it does, what I mean by extended row source statistics, that the Explain-Ash basically extends the information that is available via this so-called row source statistics. In another part, I will go into the details of the active session history information that Explain-Ash analyzes, and give you a detailed overview of what you get from Explain-Ash as part of the active session history analysis. And then there will be a separate part where I make special focus on the parallel execution skew analysis. So you can, with this Explain-Ash tool, you can do some quite interesting systematic troubleshooting of such common issues where parallel execution doesn't work as hard as it's supposed to do, so that you do not get the desired reduction in runtime. And then with Explain-Ash you can do some very interesting analysis, and I'm going to show you that in a separate part of that video tutorial. And finally, there will be a part where I explain to you what the so-called experimental stuff of the script is, what the script does internally, how you can debug the script, and how you can configure the script, because it's part of it is it has a configuration section where you can easily customize the script and also add functionality if you, for instance, have something like a custom active session history repository, which some customers do. So what is Explain-Ash actually? It's a tool to get a detailed overview of a single SQL execution. That also means that Explain-Ash is usually not the tool that you use first if you do a troubleshooting session, because first you probably have to determine if you're interested in a particular SQL execution that you want to analyze. So probably other tools and other approaches are required in order to arrive at that information that you want to get a detailed overview of a particular SQL execution. that won't be part of these tutorials. I won't go into the details how you arrive at that information that you want to get details about a particular SQL execution. There are other numerous information available about how you can arrive at that information. Explain-Ash is a simple SQL Plus script, so you don't need to install anything in the database. You can run it right away, provided that you have the required privileges in the database. It doesn't seem to run in this script mode of SQL Developer. Last time I tried it with the most recent version of SQL Developer, it didn't work properly, very likely because the script does extensive usage of substitution variables and bind variables. And although I thought it is supported in SQL Developer, it doesn't work, and I haven't investigated too much. I haven't spent too much time in trying to find out why it doesn't work, simply because I don't know SQL Developer well enough to do that. At least I can say the current version of the script doesn't seem to work properly in SQL Developer. Then the script uses some SQL constructs that will only work from Oracle 10G on. Actually, I've only used it on Oracle version 10.2 and later. And if you use this free active session history implementation Sash, which can also provide Ash functionality for active session history functionality for previous versions like Oracle 9, then indirectly, basically via this Sash, you might be able to use Explain-Ash also on earlier versions, but then this Sash repository at least has to run on a 10.2 database. Of course, you, as I've already mentioned, need, in order to run the script, you need certain select privileges on these so-called dynamic performance views, this $, active session history, $, session, and some others. And then the script will also check that as part of the initial initial processing of the script. It will check whether you have these access privileges or not, and will notify you if you do not have these. Explain-Ash in principle uses two input sources that you can use. One is the so-called row source statistics. Row source statistics is basically an additional code path in the Oracle engine that you can enable via some underscore parameters, or there are also some official ways to enable it, for instance setting statistics level to all, or use this unfortunately not really documented gather plan statistics hint, or simply by enabling SQL trace. And this additional code path then provides additional instrumentation about the SQL execution. It's basically what you also get if you enable SQL trace, because in that case this additional information will be emitted to the trace file. But the difference to the SQL trace functionality with row source statistics is that basically a part of this information is fed back into the library cache, into the corresponding child cursor, and it's populating additional information for the child cursor. So you don't have the need to analyze trace files to get at least part of this information, which is quite helpful and can be quite useful for understanding where a SQL execution spends its time, in particular on execution plan line level. It also has some downsides and some limitations, this row source statistics, and in particular you have to understand that since it is additional code that is executed, is usually not enabled by default, because it simply means overhead depending on your version and your operating system and the circumstances of the SQL execution. It can mean some significant overhead, but it can also sometimes mean that you do not have really that much overhead. So, but in principle, it's additional code that needs to run, and that's one of the main points to consider with the row source statistics. So Explain-Ash can provide further analysis based on these row source statistics, provided these are enabled. And the other main input source for analysis is the active session history, which is basically a sampling of all active sessions of the system. Periodically, usually once a second, you get a sample written to some repository where a lot of information is gathered about each active session, and with each release, with each version, Oracle has actually extended this information that is written to the active session history, and at least starting from 11.2 if you have Enterprise Edition and a Diagnostic Pack license, this is really a terrific source of information for troubleshooting. And in fact, you can probably, the most common troubleshooting scenarios, you can start with active session history and check there. And usually you already get quite a good overview and understanding of what is happening. So active session history is really a very cool feature. And even on standard edition, I would definitely recommend to install this SASH stuff so that you have at least the basic ASH functionality, because for troubleshooting transient problems that happened in the past, it's probably the most efficient troubleshooting tool that you can have. Right. Why does Explain-Ash use these two sources in particular? Their scope is a bit different, and these row source statistics are quite useful can also be useful for troubleshooting statements that do not take that long to execute, because they do a very granular analysis of what is happening. So you can even troubleshoot statements that basically only do a couple of logical IOs in order to understand if you're still not if it's still not sufficient, the performance. Then you can see, for instance, where this a couple of logical IO happen, and that's something that you can do with the row source statistics. They can also be used for troubleshooting longer running statements, like taking several seconds or minutes. But there are some severe limitations. For example, if you want to troubleshoot parallel execution statements, that's something I will show in these separate tutorial parts, where I focus specifically on row source statistics, for example. So the active session history part is very useful for troubleshooting transient problems, so that happened in the past, and that were things that took longer than a couple of seconds, because simply the granularity otherwise doesn't fit, since active session history only samples every second by default. So you won't be able to troubleshoot issues that took just a fraction of a second. On the other hand, if you have something like a statement that runs over and over again, thousands, millions of times, then again, you probably can actually use active session history to even troubleshoot such an issue. But one of the strengths of active session history is that it's enabled by default, so that is a pretty cool stuff. So rather than row source statistics that are usually not enabled by default, so you can actually troubleshoot things that happened in the past, and usually without the need to reproduce the issue, because with row source statistics you usually have to reproduce the issue. So that is a pretty cool feature of active session history. And you can in fact combine both sources in Explain-Ash and basically get the combined output, the analysis based on both data sources. That's of course also possible, but usually not that common, because row source statistics at least are not enabled by default. But I will go into the details in the row source statistics part of the tutorial. I will go into the details that you might even find a setting with row source statistics that you may want it to have enabled by default in your system, but that's probably only applicable if you do not have a tuning pack license, because with tuning pack license you have access to this cardinality information, actual cardinality information that Oracle 11g from 11g on measures automatically. So that's always on, but it's only accessible if you have a tuning pack license. Then you probably don't need to bother with the row source statistics in general, only in those cases where you have those maybe very, very short running statements. Then row source statistics might be again a good idea, but then you can maybe even also use SQL trace. What you get from Explain-Ash based on active session history is to a large degree similar to real-time SQL monitoring. And if you don't know real-time SQL monitoring, then my Oaktable fellow Doug Burns did a very cool webinar recently on allthingsoracle.com, where you can get a lot of details what real-time SQL monitoring is. It has been added in 11g and has been extended in 11.2, and it's a pretty cool feature for analyzing a single SQL execution. There is also an official landing page on the Oracle webpage where you can also see the examples and what you actually get from real-time SQL monitoring. So if you're interested in that, you can get a lot of information about that. Now you might wonder why bother with another tool if Explain-Ash is actually providing similar output to real-time SQL monitoring. The first thing is that the real-time SQL monitoring is usually only available for a rather short period of time. So these reports, this monitoring information is at least up to 11.2. It's only kept in memory, so it's not persisted to disk. And if you have a busy system, then this information might actually age out of the memory pool, the corresponding memory pool, quite quickly. Within several minutes, the information might be gone. So if you, for instance, have to troubleshoot an issue that happened last night or 7-8 hours ago or something like that, then very likely, if you do not have some custom job that tries to persist these real-time SQL monitoring reports, then very likely this information will be gone. There are also ways that you can change the configuration of real-time SQL monitoring so it actually retains the information longer in memory, but there are certainly limits to that. So troubleshooting something that happened 1 week ago or so, it's very unlikely that you are able to do that using real-time SQL monitoring. But with Explain-Ash, you can actually do some very detailed analysis of such issues, including the so-called active workload repository information. So the active session history that is implemented by Oracle is by default then written to disk. It's less granular, so only every 10th sample point is written to disk, but nevertheless this information is for troubleshooting issues that happened in the past, most of the time very useful. So Explain-Ash can do a similar analysis based on this historic information, and that is one of the strengths of Explain-Ash and one of the reasons why it might be useful in addition to real-time SQL monitoring. Of course, one of the interesting points is that Explain-Ash doesn't require a tuning pack license, but that also means that Explain-Ash misses some crucial information. So for instance, this actual cardinality that the real-time SQL monitoring shows you, which is often important to understand certain SQL execution issues, is not part of the active session history, and therefore Explain-Ash doesn't have access to that information and won't show it. Nevertheless, based on the information that Explain-Ash provides, quite often you can still, even without the actual cardinalities, can tell at least where the problem in the execution plan is probably caused. So at least to my experience, that is quite often possible, and it's still a very helpful tool. And yeah, the script is quite flexible, so it adjusts automatically to the database version where you run it. So version 10.2 has far less information, active session history, for instance, than 11.2, but it will basically simply show the maximum information available depending on the version. And I've also included some features that have only recently been added. For example, in 11.202 you get in active session history a new undocumented column where the actual parallel degree can be extracted from, and that's also implemented in Explain-Ash so that it tries to take advantage of the latest features, but it's still capable of running on older versions and basically will simply then show less information. I've also mentioned it from this version of Explain-Ash, the free active session history information implementation Sash is supported. I've tested it with the latest release, this 2.3 version, I think. And actually there are some minor modifications required to Sash in order to run with Explain-Ash, and I can provide the corresponding scripts. It's really just some minor issues, and they will actually be part of the next upcoming maintenance release. As far as I know, there will be a version 2.3.1, and that should already include all these minor changes that are required to have it running with Explain-Ash, because it doesn't really change the functionality of Sash. It's just some minor modifications. And if you run explain-ash in this sash repository, then explain-ash automatically detects this and again adjusts accordingly so that it knows that it's running in sash and will then adjust accordingly so that it works with this sash stuff. explain-ash also supports RAG, so you can do remote instance analysis. It supports this cross-instance parallel execution stuff, which can also happen in a RAG environment, that you use parallel execution and then it actually uses multiple nodes of your cluster. Then it automatically detects whether this is a serial or parallel execution, so it only shows corresponding sections of the output that are applicable, so there is no point in trying to extract information about parallel workers if there is no parallel execution, for example. So again, it basically adjusts automatically to what it detects. One of the unique insights that explain-ash offers is that it allows you to do some special troubleshooting with parallel execution. With parallel execution, you can have the problem that you actually do not get it working hard enough. So basically, your parallel workers are not busy all the time; they're staying idle, and simply by that fact, you might have the problem that although the basic execution plan is efficient, the reduction in runtime that you want to achieve by using parallel execution, you simply do not get. It doesn't matter how powerful the system is you have, it doesn't matter how many CPUs you have, how powerful your I/O subsystem is. If only one or a couple of processes are actually working on your problem, then parallel execution won't provide the benefits that you want to have. And it's usually quite complex thing to troubleshoot such issues. And the nice thing is that although you can detect with real-time SQL monitoring that you have such a problem, so it's easily you can easily see this visually in this active report that you have a problem with this parallel execution work distribution, that some of your parallel workers are actually idle for a significant amount of time. You can detect the problem. The point with real-time SQL monitoring is that it unfortunately doesn't provide you the information which operations on execution plan line level caused the problem. And therefore, if you want to troubleshoot that systematically and understand what you might have to do in order to address the problem, you are basically more or less left with trial and error with real-time SQL monitoring. And for that reason, since I've spent a lot of time in troubleshooting parallel execution, in particular also on Exadata environments, I've developed that part of the explain-ash tool where I think you can do a very interesting analysis of such issues. And the nice thing of this analysis is that since it's based on active session history, you usually can do this analysis without having to reproduce the issue. It can be quite time consuming trying to repeat a certain data load of a big amount of data. You have to use the same, maybe you have to use the same data feed, you have to use the same environment settings and so on. That can be quite tedious and a time-consuming job. And in order to get to the information, in order to systematically troubleshoot the issue, so there are other ways you can do that. But most of these ways require you to actually reproduce the issue in a lab, under lab conditions, basically. And with explain-ash, you can actually address or analyze this based on active session history without having to reproduce the issue, which is pretty nice. If you have an issue that happened last night or a week ago, you will be able with explain-ash to analyze this issue without having to reproduce the thing, and find from the information that explain-ash provides how you can fix the problem even without having to reproduce it. So that's one of the unique things that explain-ash offers, and I have therefore a separate part of this video tutorial where I go into the details how such troubleshooting looks like, what the other methods are that you can use, and what it looks like if you use explain-ash, and that's quite interesting. The current version of explain-ash does have a limitation that you should be aware of. If you have a SQL execution that makes use of recursive SQL execution, so most likely something like a user-defined PL SQL function that in turn runs another SQL that takes a significant amount of time in comparison to the total SQL execution time of the main SQL statement, then Explain-Ash, the current version, doesn't cope very well with that. I've already ideas how to address that, and one of the upcoming versions very likely will at least provide information that makes that more obvious. That is one of the parts where real-time SQL monitoring at present makes it at least a bit more obvious that you are spending a lot of time in this recursive execution. Right, and I think that's it basically, the overview, and then let's go to the next parts.